back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to share how I care for my Dendrobium Phalaenopsis type orchids. It's going to be a quick 10-minute video, so by the end of this, you're going to know how to grow these orchids indoors, especially if you're new to this kind of orchid, and you'll be able to understand how to care for it, how to grow it, how to water, fertilize, and how to make them bloom. Now, if you guys are looking for Dendrobium care for other kinds of Dendrobium orchids, there's Nobile orchids, there's Anosmum orchids, and there's Latoria type orchids. I have care videos for those linked down below. This video is specific to Dendrobium Phalaenopsis orchids, which are super common. These are what you most see in flower shops, garden centers, and I'm gonna focus on that. So let's jump right in. So why do I like these? So I find that they're very easy to grow. They tend to flower quite easily. They're very tolerant to neglect, and they also tend to bloom off old spikes. So when you have a mature Dendrobium orchid, you tend to have large sprays of flowers, multiple spikes, which is really nice. And they're pretty easy to grow in general. So that's what I really like about these orchids. So there's different kinds of Dendrobium Phalaenopsis orchids. Some of them are about 1 foot tall. Some of them grow up to like 4 feet tall. I've had some larger Dendrobium orchids in my collection. I grow them all indoors here in my apartment in New York City. I've gotten them all to bloom quite easily, but I've gotten rid of the really big 4 feet ones just because they were just taking up too much space. But I'm gonna focus on some of the smaller ones. So this one is the Dendrobium Pink Sparkle. I don't know the parents for that one, for this one. I think it's just a common trade name, but this one for sure, I know the parents of. This one's the Dendrobium Inobi Purple. This one's really nice. I only got 2 spikes right now, just because I recently repotted it. So sometimes they're a little set back, but next time it blooms, I might get like 5 or 6. But I find these really easy. Most of the Dendrobium Phalaenopsis type orchids come from the Dendrobium bigibum, and that's usually a parent for these orchids. And they have a flower that looks kind of like a Phalaenopsis, but they're not related to Phalaenopsis at all. So it's just really because of the way that the flower looks, but these are all Dendrobium type orchids. These orchids don't have any fragrance, but they're very easy to bloom. I think that's why I like them so much. They give you a lot of flowers. They're very easy, but no fragrance. Very similar to Phalaenopsis in that regard, even though they're very different. So Dendrobiums, they have multiple canes. So they grow a new cane. I tend to get like 2 or 3 canes every year, especially on these smaller ones. On the bigger ones, they grow a little bit slower for me just because it takes so long for those to push out. But these 2 to 3 canes per year, and they tend to flower when the canes mature. So in terms of care, these are very warm to hot growing orchids. So they really like the temperatures hot. I try to keep the temperatures above 60 degrees. Given that I grow indoors, if you keep the temperatures over 60 degrees, you're gonna be fine. A lot of growers down in Florida and in other warm places in the world, they can grow these outdoors and they do just fine. The warmer the better. The more warm it is, the faster that they grow, the more bright light they get, the warmth, basically better. If it's cooler temperatures, let's say you have only 70 degrees, it's gonna grow slower. So the blooms and the growth is gonna be impacted with the temperatures that you give this orchid. These hybrids are generally native to Australia, New Guinea. That's from the bigibum parent. And those tend to have it pretty prevalent in it. So this one has about over 80% Dendrobium bigibum in it. And that one's a smaller one, so that's why I like that one so much. So how do I grow these orchids? I use, in the media, you could use whatever you want, provided that the roots are nice and airy. So for those of you new orchid growers, I would never put these in soil or anything like that. Typically, we like to use airy mixes, such as bark. I like to grow in a mix of sphagnum moss and bark, and I have one in leca that's working out pretty well for now, but I'm going to be transitioning that into sphagnum moss and bark. You want something airy that you'll be able to water thoroughly, so you could water it in your sink, let the water flow through, so you want to water it abundantly, and then you're going to water it again as it gets dry. In terms of fertilizer in the growing season, so between the spring to the beginning of fall, I like to give fertilizer to these orchids at full strength. You could follow the directions on the package. I use MSU fertilizer and that tends to work pretty well. In the winter, these tend to slow down and they need a little break, especially after they bloom. So then I let it dry a little bit more. They don't really require as much water then, so maybe I'll let it dry for like 2 days before I water again. But I do not fertilize them in the winter. With that said, these aren't evergreen orchids. They're constantly growing, so they slow, but they don't need a dormancy period like some of the other Dendrobium types. In terms of flowering, these flower when their new growths mature. I find that for a lot of these hybrids, they tend to give you some bloom sometimes off some of the older canes, which is really nice. So I've had this orchid in particular, which is the Dendrobium Anobi purple. I've had 5-6 spikes before easily, and I get new growths off the old canes. Now you'll notice some of these canes are bare, and over time they will lose their leaves, which is completely normal. But when you're growing them, these still provide energy to the plant, so don't get rid of them. But if you divide them later on, you want to make sure that you have newer growths on both divisions, and it'll continue from there. But these provide good energy for the plant. So with regards to the growth pattern, as I mentioned, these tend to grow faster in the summer. When it's warmer, the more warmth you give it, the more they grow. So I mean, it's not the same flowering and growth for everyone. It really depends on your environment. The warmer, the hotter it is, the better it's gonna grow, the more it's gonna flower. I tend to get blooms on these maybe twice a year. The smaller ones tend to grow a little bit faster. The bigger ones tend to grow a little bit slower. Those maybe I get a growth, one big growth per year, sometimes two if I'm lucky. But as I said, I have gotten rid of a lot of those because they're just so big, and a 4-foot Dendrobium is pretty big for me, but you could still absolutely grow those indoors provided you're giving it enough light. Now on that topic, these really love bright light. So these can get up to Vanda level light. I give them Cattleya level light. You could grow these in full sun provided you acclimate them slowly to the sun. And in terms of sun, you don't want to give them bright full sun in the middle of summer when it's like, I don't know, 115 degrees, let's say, because it'll scorch the leaves. So if you're going to give it full sun, you want to acclimate your plant slowly. So slowly give it direct sun, maybe for half an hour, then 2 hours, and so on and so forth. And monitor the leaves to make sure it's not scorching. But this is an orchid that can tolerate very high levels of light. Just don't go from moderate light to full light. The downsides for these orchids is that they're spider mite magnets. So anytime I have thrips, anytime I have spider mites, I notice that these have like a sap on the leaves, and these tend to attract them quite a lot. So that's the downside for growing these. I would say that's probably the only downside. Maybe the other downside is that some of these grow very large. So that's why I'm focused on just the smaller ones. So the Dendrobium Pink Sparkle, which I just showed you, is quite small, which is nice. And then the Dendrobium Anobi Purple stays quite small. There's the Anobi Purple Splash, which I don't have, but that's a really common hybrid. That one stays quite small, which is really nice. But if you have limited space, just know that some of them can grow enormous. So that might be a downside, but it might be an upside if you have a lot of room. So the upsides to growing these orchids is that they bloom very easily. These orchids can handle neglect really well, which is great. So if you have like a Phalaenopsis orchid and you forget to water it for 3 weeks, it's gonna be in rough shape. If you forget to water your Dendrobium for 3 weeks, remember you have storage units and all these canes, so this is storing energy. Phalaenopsis orchids are just basically leaves, so they're not gonna be storing that much energy. They're not gonna be in great shape. But these are really tough. So one of the upsides is that they're, I don't want to say they're indestructible, but they're one of the more easy orchids to grow. I think that covers it. So in short, you want to make sure that you're giving it something airy to grow in. So it could be bark, moss. You could even grow it in leca if you want, coconut husk. Just make sure you're giving it something that's airy, yet when you water it, you want to water it abundantly and make sure that it drains properly. Water it when it dries, and then it should be just fine. And then you'll find that if you keep the temperatures warm, you're giving it bright indirect light, it's going to thrive for you. If you want to give it sunlight, be very careful. Just make sure you're adopting it very slowly, and it should be just fine. Let me know what your favorite Dendrobium type orchids are down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone.